everyone! Today with Clil Thinks, we have a brief video to explain what Clil is and what Clil is not. I'm going to interview Matthew Johnson, who is a specialist in this area. So, are you ready? As you can see here, there are some important words related to the Clil approach. First of all, Matthew, why is Clil an approach?
Thanks, Sandra. I'm glad that's the first question you asked. An approach is not really like a methodology. An approach is a set of guiding principles that you keep in mind when you're working in a particular way. So the Clil approach means that there are some ideas behind it that we have to take into account, but it's not a set of rules that we have to apply. It's not rigid. It's not fixed. It's not like a recipe where you follow step 1 and then step 2 and then step 3, etc. Basically, it's a series of ideas that you have in mind when you're working in this particular way.
Okay, I understand. So Clil is like a guide, not a recipe.
Exactly.
The second question is, what are the pedagogical principles behind Clil?
Okay, so first of all, Clil follows the 4 C's framework, which is the famous framework of Do Coyle of content, cognition, communication, and culture. So first of all, content. Clil is for teaching content subjects through the medium of a foreign language. Cognition is all about thinking skills and developing higher order thinking skills. So at the same time that we're learning content, we should be developing those skills in our students as well. Also, communication is a key concern inside Clil. So while we're developing the content knowledge and the cognition, we're also trying to develop the communicative competencies through the content. And so in that way, we're using the contents to develop communicative competencies, but we're also using the language to try and develop the content and the cognition. And the 4th C is culture. And this really means kind of intercultural competencies. When we learn a foreign language, it's most often because we want to or we're going to need to communicate with people from other cultures. And knowing the words, just knowing the language itself is not enough to effectively communicate. So we need this intercultural element as well. Also, Clil is constructivist in nature, which means that we're trying to create the conditions for students to construct their own knowledge rather than just transmitting the knowledge to them. This means that it's very learner-centered, that they're very actively involved in doing things in the classroom. We need to give them the scaffolding, we need to give them the help, the extra help that they need to get from their present level of knowledge and ability to where we want them to get to. This involves formative assessment as well, which means not just testing them to give them a final mark, but assessing them so that they actually learn through the process of being assessed, which can be a difficult thing to do. And also, we're talking about developing academic literacy here. So I mentioned before about communication, but it's also communicating not just orally, but also in written form and particularly in academic contexts. So those are the kind of principles that are behind the approach.
Okay, thanks. So there are lots of principles behind Clil.
There are, yeah.
I heard Clil described as being content-driven. What does that mean?
Okay, content-driven, exactly. I often say that content is king, and what I mean by that is that content is the most important part. It's actually an expression by Steve Jobs for Apple, but he was talking about something a little bit different. But content-driven basically means that it's the content which dictates the language that you need to learn. So it's not like traditional language teaching where you might decide, okay, we'll do the present first, and then we'll do the past, and then we'll do the future, and then we'll do the present perfect, and you make arbitrary decisions about what language you're going to study. No, in the case of Clil, the language is the language which is inherent in the content which you are studying. So it's the content which basically makes all of the decisions about the language that you focus on. In that sense, it's not language driven like traditional language teaching, but content driven.
Everybody, remember that content is king. Matthew, and also I heard that Clil is procedurally rich. What's that?
Well, I think that clearly is all about richness. It's about being rich in general. We talk about rich input in Clil, meaning that it's not only textbooks, but also audio-visual material, realia, real objects. You can exploit anything, songs, cartoons, all sorts of things, rather than just text from textbooks. But procedurally rich means that the students are actually involved in doing something, so that it's not the transmission of knowledge, as I said before, from the teacher to the students. The students are actually following a series of steps in completing activities and constructing their own knowledge. So we talked before about scaffolding. Scaffolding is key in this idea of being procedurally rich, because it's about taking small steps to improve your knowledge, to improve your competencies, because maybe where you would like your students to get to from the position they're at the moment, that step, that jump is much too big. So we have to create smaller steps with activities which have a lot of procedure, a lot of active involvement, so that they can get there little by little.
Totally, another important factor. Thank you. The next concept for me is very meaningful in a good pedagogical and education system. Yes, I'm talking about learner center. Matthew, could you explain this concept and why is it important?
Well, I think it's clear why this is important. If we think about it logically, why should the teacher be the center, or why should the teacher be the protagonist in the teaching learning process? It's the teacher already knows what he or she needs to know. It's the students who should be the protagonist. They should be at the center of the process. So being learner-centered is all related to this idea of being constructivist and being procedurally rich. We want students to be actively engaged in completing meaningful tasks which will contribute towards their learning. And really, if they're the center as well, then we should also take into account their personal situation, their personal lives. They are individuals, they're important as individuals. We need to try and make sure that the things they learn are relevant to their lives as well. So we need to find this connection. So I don't know, I think this is quite an easy one to explain. It should be obvious, really, that learning should be learner-centered.
So again, everybody remember to put your students and not yourself at the center of the process. And the last question, Matthew, in this part is, what is language awareness?
Okay, so I would say that Clil teachers are not language teachers. They're not foreign language teachers anyway. However, I would say that every subject is a language subject, regardless of whether you're teaching it in the mother tongue or through the medium of a foreign language. Because, and I always tend to say this, you can't talk about science without the language of science, and you can't talk about history or art without the language of history or art. So really, in order for students to have access to the content and for them to be able to express their knowledge of the content, the teacher needs to take into account the language demands of their subject or the particular topic that they're studying. So that the teacher has to have a very heightened awareness of the language that is involved. And this means developing the CALP. We talked a little bit about this before, the cognitive academic language proficiency. It means developing this cognitive academic language which is related to the subject that they teach. So in this sense, Clil is very language aware, not just because it's teaching through a foreign language, but because we use language to learn. So we obviously have to be very conscious about the language demands of any particular subject or any particular topic.
So Matthew, now we have an idea about what Clil is, but some people confuse Clil with other things. So what is Clil not?
Yeah, you're right. People do confuse Clil with other things. And here we have a list of a few of the common things or common misconceptions about Clil.
So why do you see the Clil methodology in so many places if Clil is not a methodology?
Well, as you said before, lots of people are confused about Clil. There are also some people that argue that Clil is a methodology, but really most experts don't think it is. And the reason for this is because, as we mentioned before, a methodology is very prescriptive. It's a series of steps that you have to follow, and it's quite rigid. And Clil is not like that. Clil is almost more like a philosophy. Now, there are a series of considerations behind it, the kind of things we've seen already. It's very language aware, it's content driven, but there's no real recipe for doing Clil. There's a series of things that you have to take into account. It's a little bit like in language teaching, the communicative approach. Again, this is not a set recipe, it's an approach because it's a series of guidelines and considerations that you have to follow, but it's not something which is totally prescriptive. It's more flexible than that.
Well, Matthew, you would also say that Clil isn't foreign language teaching.
No, of course not. We said before, it's content driven. It's the teaching of content through a foreign language, a vehicular language. This is one of the things that makes me really quite frustrated when I hear about the Clil methodology for teaching English as a foreign language. It's absurd. That's not the point. It's the Clil approach for teaching content through a foreign language.
So what is clear is that it's content teaching, not language teaching.
Exactly. There is a model of Clil which is soft Clil, and soft Clil is more language driven. But this is quite similar to content-based language teaching. So it's using topics, maybe more academic topics, to teach the language. But true Clil, or what's called hard Clil, is, as we've said before, is content driven. Of course, you need the language to access the content, and you use the content to develop the language. But, as I've said before, I'll say it again, content is king.
So Clil is not only teaching in English, right?
That's right. This is another one of the big misconceptions. You find this in lots of schools. Lots of schools talk about the fact that bilingual schools, that they're doing Clil, and they're not really doing Clil at all in many cases. They're just teaching the content in English. And Clil, whilst it's not a methodology, it is an approach which has some very clear foundations. Unfortunately, the reality is, and I'm not blaming teachers for this, it's not their fault, but there hasn't been enough investment in teacher training. Bilingual programs in Spain have happened almost overnight, and there hasn't been enough investment, as I said, in training those teachers in the methodological changes that they need to implement in order to make it effective. So clearly is much more than just teaching in English or in any foreign language. Not a methodology, but there are lots of things we have to take into account, the things that we've already mentioned.
I've heard that Clil is an umbrella term, but you think it's not.
I think this is the one thing that's done more damage to understanding Clil than anything else. I think it was David Marsh who said that Clil is an umbrella term used for different approaches for teaching content through a foreign language. And really it's just not the case, because if we call Clil an umbrella term that covers all of these different teaching approaches, it means that any teaching through a foreign language is Clil, and that's really not the case. It's related to the previous thing that we were just talking about. It's much more than just teaching in English. Clil is not total immersion. Clil is not content-based language teaching. Clil is something very, very specific.
Great, Matthew. Thank you for making a few things about Clil a little more clear for us.
No, thank you, Sandra. I hope it's been useful, and I look forward to going into more detail about some of these things on our blog in the future. So, thanks very much.